Welcome to part two of lecture on the social forces that shaped California. And so in this part, we're going to talk about the Great Depression and migration into California. And so first, what was the Great Depression, which you have likely heard of it in school. In 1929, the stock market crashed. And you had this global economic depression. So we recently in the United States, about 9 years ago, went through a recession, a very, very bad one, a global recession. This one was much, much worse. And agricultural communities were hit probably the hardest, with crop prices falling by nearly 60%. But you had massive amounts of unemployment at this time, lots of people out of work, with no resources. This is a picture called, I think it's Migrant Mother. It's quite a famous photograph that was taken at the time of an Okie, which I'll talk about in a few slides. But basically, lots of people migrating from Oklahoma and the surrounding region to California for work. And we're going to talk about why that is. This woman kind of became an iconic image of white poverty in the United States, despite the fact that she's actually not white. She is Native American. But this was taken by a pretty famous photographer after she had finished the day working in the fields. So at the same time as you have this Great Depression going on, you also have something called the Dust Bowl that's happening, which happened in the 1930s. And so basically, in places in Oklahoma, they had plowed grasslands for wheat. They had excessively plowed, and then they went through a drought. And when they went through a drought, basically what happened was you had these huge dust storms. And so land became unfarmable during this drought. You can see this massive dust storm in this picture and just the sheer amount of dust that would bury land. And so millions of tons of topsoil was eroded, and many people had to leave their farms to find work elsewhere, because they had kind of lost their livelihood through this coupling of the Great Depression, which made crop prices so bad, but then this ecological disaster that happened. And so you get people migrating to California from this part of the United States, and they are called Okies, often used as a discriminatory term in California to describe them. These poor migrant workers who are coming in droves to find work. So these are basically displaced farmers from Oklahoma and nearby states surrounding Oklahoma. Over 1 million people migrated to California from these areas during that time because there was just no resources. And so many of them came in, they lived in these migrant work camps that were not great at all, and just traveled around looking for work. And at this time, you get this writer, John Steinbeck, who you've probably heard of, who wrote his very famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath, based upon these Okies who moved out to California. And so this novel became extraordinarily popular and kind of brought people's awareness to the plight of these people, although their attention was pretty short-lived. But he kind of went to these different migrant work camps, and he interviewed these people, and he talked to some of the people that they worked with, and he really felt their plight. And so he wrote the story, The Grapes of Wrath, which was then turned into a film to even bring it more national attention. But I want to talk a little bit about like what California agriculture looked like before and after this period, to kind of get an understanding of like how it works when people are coming into this space, and how other people are being displaced. So California agriculture was not based on small family farming before this time. California was growing huge cash crops. So not necessarily that the farms were enormous, but you had a relatively few amount of people owning a lot of farms, growing these cash crops. First, it was the wheat boom. Once you get the Transcontinental Railroad, lots of wheat can be grown in California and then shipped to other places, or transported rather to other places via the railroad. But then there becomes a focus on the growing of fruits and vegetables, which we still have today. We grow plenty of other stuff in California, but we grow lots of fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables are very, very labor intensive, right? You cannot have a machine that goes out and picks tomatoes. A person has to pick tomatoes. So you need lots of labor in order to do this. And so you need migrant workers. And so originally there were different waves of migrant workers who worked in the agricultural fields in California. Chinese, Japanese, some Europeans, primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe, Indians, and I mean people from India. There was an influx of them for a while, and then Mexicans. And then you get the influx of these Okies who come in looking for this agricultural work. And again, so we have first Chinese who are then displaced due to all this Chinese Exclusion Act, and that labor pool drives up. So you have these shifting labor pools to deal with this California agricultural demand. So again, Steinbeck saw these migrants as different, as these other groups of people who had worked in California and who worked in very poor conditions, who had tried to organize. But Steinbeck saw these white families as different because they will refuse to accept the role of field peon with attendant terrorism, squalor, and starvation. So he really saw them as the future of agricultural work in California, that they were going to organize and demand better wages and really kind of change what it looked like to work in the fields in California. And while some did organize and strike, the majority of them were actually unwilling. They still saw themselves as small farmers. They didn't really see themselves as migrant farm workers. And you also had the Associated Farmers was a very, very strong group that was opposed to unions. So these were generally not the type of people to unionize. They saw themselves as more individualistic. And so they also had very little political clout, right? You have this group that's coming in from somewhere else. They're not particularly strong. These migrant work camps were often disliked by Californians. They thought that they were also sapping their resources out. So people worried about migrant work camps and then their schools being flooded by their children and them having no resources. But again, they thought of themselves as farmers. They didn't necessarily think of themselves as this migrant farm pickers, right? They were there because of a circumstance that was happening to them at the moment, and they needed to be there. They were very, very poor. It's not to say that these people were at all well off, but they didn't see themselves as kind of this group of people who would organize. They saw themselves as individual farmers. And again, at this time, you have the New Deal, which was Roosevelt's plan to kind of bring us out of the Depression. So you get lots of public programs and public assistance, but generally speaking, these did not apply to agricultural workers, which kind of compounds their poverty and their situation because they're not eligible for all types of things that people who work in other sectors are. And what eventually pulls these people out of poverty and out of this situation is the labor shortage that's created by World War II. So remember, we have a labor surplus during the Depression, and then during World War II, we get a labor shortage. And so now, because there's a labor shortage, these people who are white are able to move into industry much more easily than other groups can. And so what I want to talk about is something else that's going on during this period of time, which your text does not talk about, and that's Mexican repatriation. So between 1929 and 1944, again, during this economic depression, the U.S. deported nearly 2 million people of Mexican descent back to Mexico. 1.2 million of them were American citizens. So Some had trouble proving that they were American citizens. Many were deported without regard. Many families had lived in the United States for, or what was now the United States, for a very long time. So again, you get this minority population that's being discriminated against during this economic downturn. And what happened though is after World War II, you have a problem where now you have these Okies who have moved out of this agricultural sector into industry. So what do you need now? You need laborers in order to come in and work back in the field. So you get something called the Bracero program. The Bracero program is a worker exchange program with Mexico, by where Mexican men predominantly get to come into the United States on a worker's visa in order to work in the fields, although there are very strict restrictions on this, and many of them are taken advantage of. So again, you get that labor shortage due to World War II. So now you have people going to fight the war. This is also when you have a lot of women entering the workforce. But generally speaking, we need people in the U.S. to work, and we especially need people to work in the field. And so again, U.S. farm workers had left farms to either head to war or to take higher paying factory jobs. And so between 1942 and 1964, the Bracero program sponsored nearly 4.5 million guest workers to come into the United States. It carried on well past World War II, but the height of the program was really during World War II. And so the program had some very strict guidelines that were laid out. And this is like text from the Bracero program itself, but Mexican workers should not suffer any discriminatory consequences. Transportation and living expenses should be covered by their employer. They have to be given hygienic lodgings, and the workers will be paid full agreed upon salary with no deductions. And the reality of this was much different. Also, their contracts were to be written in Spanish, which was not the case. So that they could understand what they were signing, because many of them could not speak English. And so the program became extremely corrupt. Large amounts of workers showed up at the border and were often waiting their weeks with no provisions before they were let into the United States. The workers were treated like cattle. They were sprayed with DDT when they came into the country. And then when they went to work on these farms, they were given horrible living conditions. You can see here people sleeping on plywood bunks. They were not supposed to have to pay for their own equipment, but they wound up having to pay for their own equipment. And again, they're here as a guest worker program, so they really don't have any rights once they get into California. As part of their contract, Braceros agreed to have 10% of their wages withheld and placed in a fund controlled by the Mexican government. And the idea there was they wanted to have a pool of money for these men back in Mexico so that they would make sure that they would return to Mexico, because they didn't want them to stay in the United States permanently. But an overwhelming majority of workers never received compensation, and the whereabouts of those funds still remain unknown due to corruption on the Mexican side of the border. But the entire program was run extraordinarily poorly to the detriment of the Braceros. I actually have a friend whose father came into the U.S. on this program. He never received that money that was supposed to be held back in Mexico for him. And many former Braceros now live in dire poverty, abandoned by both governments. So not just the United States, but also the Mexican government didn't uphold their end of the bargain. And so who were Braceros? Because a lot of people tend to think as migrant farm workers as unskilled laborers, but they were actually very experienced farm workers, and they turned U.S. and California agricultural land into some of the most productive land in the world. We grow an incredible amount of food in the world, and a lot of that is due to the Mexican farm workers, experienced Mexican farm workers who came in. So I just want you to think about this these economics that come into play, and then these groups that are targeted, right? This intersection of economics, racism, and migration. So now you're going to proceed on to your next chapter, and then we're going to come back for part 3 of lecture for this module.